Discuss the chaos in Syria. The government's brutal crackdown on protesters shows no signs of letting up. Syrian army tanks and snipers taking aim at civilians in the streets of Daraa. What's at stake here for the U.S. and for the other players in the Middle East? Jamie Rubin, as former Assistant Secretary of State, joins us now. We heard Ambassador Rice, Susan Rice, our ambassador to the UN, say that she knows that, in fact, Iran is lending support to the Syrian regime in its endeavor to kill its own people. What does that mean, support? What do you think is happening here between Iran and the Syrian regime?
Yes, Syria and Iran have an alliance of sorts involving the transshipment of weaponry from Iran through Syria to their allies in Lebanon, Hezbollah, potentially, and Hamas as well. Syria and Iran for decades now have had a working relationship, which is unusual for an Arab country to be working so closely with Iran, a Persian nation. And in this case, the Iranians see Syria as a crucial way for them to have an influence, not only in Syria itself, but in Lebanon and throughout the Middle East, and have access to a border country with Israel where they want to cause problems.
How do we explain that we readily went into Libya, where the atrocities against civilian Libyans were nowhere near what's going on in Syria now and what's historically happened in Syria? The Syrian regime, Bashar al-Assad, is the son of a man who was in power for a long time and oversaw a great deal of cruelty against Syrian civilians. So how do we justify this difference in the way we act?
Well, I think the administration has had a rough time explaining precisely what they're doing in each different country. But I think it is important in foreign affairs, especially when it comes to the use of force, to not get into a situation of a cookie cutter. You do this if this happens. And Libya had some specific circumstances. Number one, Gaddafi was essentially an international outlaw before this. We were trying to make nice with him, but he had been responsible for great evil in this world. He also spoke very clearly about his intention to kill individual Libyans, house to house. So we had a really bad leader who had an international reputation like that, and a argument that he was going to go house to house and start killing his own people. Syria, one difference is they are claiming that they're cracking down only because of the protesters. They're trying to reform their country. Their outsiders are playing a role. But I think you're right. The Assad family has a lot of blood on its hands for 20,000 in the city of Hama back in the early 80s from people rising up against
some Western leaders
the regime.
Who seem to think or have said that he is a reformer. I mean, reformer, I guess, with quotation marks. And in fact, later in the month of May, this country, Syria, is actually up for a vote whether it should be on a Human Rights Council at the UN, which seems less and less likely by the day.
Well, yes. Look, the reason why people think Bashar Assad might be a reformer is because of his manner, his style, where he comes from. I interviewed him for Sky News when I was an anchor there. I spent the day with him. He comes across, let's be frank, as a very appealing, relatively normal guy. The problem is the things he says, excuse me, have nothing in common with the things he does. And when it comes to the doing, it's a pretty horrific show.
Let's talk about the doing, because there's been some criticism this week because of a New Yorker article about the president's strategy in the region, saying, quote, that he's leading from behind in the region. You're kind of critical of leading from behind. How do you do that as the United States?
I got to tell you that is one of the single dumbest quotes I've seen an administration official make in a long, long time. I think what they were trying to say, however poorly, is that the president believes that the United States can't be responsible for all the military actions in the world, that we have to use our alliances, that when it's in Europe or near Europe, we should be helping Europeans do the doing themselves, so that we're not expending all of our burden the way we are Afghanistan, Iraq, and now Libya. So the idea of burden sharing and having regional power centers, and rather than the world policeman, the United States, is a correct idea. But you're not going to do it by leading from behind. You've got to do it with consistent involvement in these issues. You've got to convince your allies of your seriousness. And one of the problems is in Libya, it's been going on for weeks and weeks and weeks, is because we're we sort of are half in and half out.
Right.
And but for a few airplanes, AC-130 aircraft and particular fighter A-10 aircraft, Gaddafi would be in a much worse position. But we pulled those aircraft out of the fight. That's kind of hard to understand, lending them to the fight, this unique equipment, and then pulling it out.
All right, Jamie, good to see you. Thanks very much. This is going to continue to be a very complicated situation. Jamie Rubin is a former Assistant Secretary of State and